what's up guys, this is Mr. Winters. In this video I'm going to teach you the parts of a board, and we're also going to go over the safety of the compound miter saw and how to use the compound miter saw. So we'll start off with the parts of a board. So when you look at a board, you're going to see the grain of the wood, and on this board the grain is going this way. So we call this part of the board the face. This part of the board is the edge. And that part of the board is called the end grain. So we have face, edge, end grain. There are 4 types of cuts that we're going to be making in wood shop. The first cut is if we just cut straight across the grain. So if I just cut a saw straight across the grain, that is called a cross cut. If I turn the board this way and I go with the grain, that is called a rip cut. Now, if I take my blade and I turn it at an angle like this, and I cut across the face at an angle, that is called a miter cut. And the last cut we have cuts off the edge like this along the end grain or along the edge, and it's called a bevel. So we have the parts of a board: face grain, edge, end grain, and the types of cuts: cross cut, miter cut, rip cut, and then lastly, if we take something off of the edge, that is called a bevel. This is the compound miter saw. It's called a compound miter saw because this saw can go down and cut, and it also can pull out, and then you can cut down and back. So this one here is a compound miter saw. We have 2 of these in the shop. The one over here, this is just called a miter saw. It does not pull out and go down. It just cuts straight down. So they're very similar tools. This board can only cut a board about 5 inches thick, whereas the compound miter saw can cut a board that's like 10 inches thick. So if you have a wider board, you can use the compound miter saw. If you have a thinner board, you can just use the miter saw. So as you can see at the back of the shop, we've got the compound miter saw and then just the miter saw there. There are 2 types of cuts that we're going to make on the miter saw. The first type of cut would just be a cross cut. So what that means is we're laying the board here. This part right here is called the table. This part right here is called the fence. When you're cutting the board, this piece of wood always has to be tight to the table and tight to the fence. When that blade spins, the pressure of the blade spinning is going to send the board down into the machine. So we want to be tight to the table and tight to the fence so that the board doesn't kick on us. If you try to cut a board out here, the second that blade hits the board, it's going to kick on you and possibly get thrown back at you. So again, the 2 types of cuts we can make is if we have the board like this and we're just cutting straight at a 90-degree angle. Right down here, you're going to see these little numbers. I'll zoom in on these for you. And right now we're set at 0. So what that means is we're going to get a 90-degree cut, or basically a straight cut. That's called a cross cut. The other type of cut we can make on this saw is called a miter cut. What we're going to do there is loosen this knob, and then there's a little lever that you lift, and you can turn the saw to an angle. So one of the projects we're going to make, we turn the saw to a 30-degree angle. So you can see, now I have a 30-degree angle, and that's where the miter saw gets its name, because now I can cut, and it's going to cut at an angle, or what's called a miter cut. So the 2 types of cuts we make on the miter saw are a cross cut and a miter cut. You should never do a rip cut on this saw. What that means is you turn the board this way with the end grain and try to cut like that. That is bad, and that's going to cause injuries or cause kickback. Kickback is when the board gets thrown back at you. Make sure that you never cross your arms. So if I'm trying to cut a board, I have a board here I'm going to cut in a minute. I got my line marked there. I never want to go like this and cross my arms and try to run it like this. Or be here and then do something like this. You see how my arms are crossing? You should never be like that. You should be to the side of the saw. This hand is supporting the board and making sure that it stays tight to the table and tight to the fence. And then my arm does the cut. So you should never cross your arms when running this saw. The next thing is, after you make your cut, you're going to be left with a piece of wood. You always have to wait till the saw stops running before you clear that piece of wood. When I start this saw, it only takes about 3 seconds to shut off. Now it's stopped. Now you can clear your cut off pieces of wood out of the way. Or a guard right here. Make sure that is always in place and you never remove the guards. As you lower the saw, the guard moves out of the way. That is there to protect you from cutting your fingers. On the saw itself, you're going to see red lines where I've marked with red marker. That distance is about 6 inches. So there's about 6 inches here and 6 inches here. The safety rule on this saw is that your fingers should never be within 6 inches of the blade. So if I'm going to cut this board, I'm tight to the table, tight to the fence, and I need to think about where that red zone is. I need to have my hand past the red zone to support the board. Now, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you have a little clamp right here that can spin around, and it can clamp your board down and hold it for you. Personally, I don't ever use this because I know if I'm 6 inches away that I'm not going to get hurt. But it is there if you want to use it. When you're cutting, this hand is holding the board tight to the table and tight to the fence, and it's at least 6 inches away. Now, as far as the minimal length of a piece of board for you to cut on this saw, if you have a board that is less than 6 inches, your fingers are going to be in the 6-inch zone. So we're not cutting any pieces of wood less than 6 inches on this saw. If we need to cut a board smaller than that, we can use a different tool like the bandsaw. Now last year I had a kid, he almost got hurt because he had a cylindrical piece of wood, or a piece of wood that looked like this, you know. He tried to cut it on this saw, and the second the blade hit the piece of wood, it kicked on him. So miter saws are not made to cut round pieces of wood or cylindrical type pieces of wood. So no round wood or no cylindrical wood. The last thing on this saw is, when you're running this saw, make sure you wear your safety glasses and make sure you have hearing protection. This saw is loud enough that it could cause damage to ears. Now, when it's time to make a cut, you're going to have your measurement. Now, when I make a line of measurement, I always put an X on the side that is the scrap. So over here, this piece is not what I want. It's going to be like garbage. This is the piece of wood that I want. When you cut, you don't cut right on the line, or you're going to cut off a piece of your board. You want to put the blade right on the edge of that line. So I'm going to set this up and show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go tight to the table, tight to the fence. Then I'm going to bring the saw down and look where it's going to hit. All right, so if you look at that blade, you can see how I'm not cutting on the line, I'm cutting right next to the line, and the blade is where the X is. So when I cut that off, I should just barely be able to still see my line. Run this real fast and show you how this done. So we got our safety glasses, got our hearing protection. I'm gonna use this hand. Now I got long sleeves on, so I'm gonna make sure I pull my sleeves up, think about all that safety stuff. This hand is holding the board tight to the fence. I'm gonna bring this down and make sure my blade is right along the edge of the line. Then I'm gonna come up. Now you don't have to come all the way up. You just have to come up about 1 inch above your wood, start the saw, and cut straight down through with a nice, slow, steady cut. Now, if you did it correct, you should just barely still be able to see your pencil line. So that was a cross cut. If I want to do a miter cut, I turn the saw, and then it's the same process. So my hands are 6 inches away, I'm tight to the table, tight to the fence, and then I cut. So there's a miter cut, there's a cross cut. Okay, that's everything you need to know on the safety of the miter saw and how to use the miter saw. If you need me to show you in person, just ask me and I'm happy to show you. Be creative, make stuff, use these cool tools. We'll see you on the next video.